Hello everybody, and welcome to the first video in my custom content making tutorial series. In this series, I'm going to show you how to make a variety of different kinds of custom content, from poses to objects to accessories, from start to finish using Blender, Photoshop, and Sims 4 Studio. This first video of the series is going to introduce beginners to Blender and familiarize you with the interface and workspace. Blender is a very powerful tool whose limits are mainly your skill level and creativity. Anything you can imagine you can create here in this program. I want to begin by introducing you to the File tab, because there's a few things here that are important and I want to talk about them before I get too much further. First, there's New, which will open a fresh startup file. Then there's Open and Open Recent, which open existing .blend files you already have saved. It's useful to note that you can copy anything from your clipboard and it will stay copied in this window of Blender, even if you move to another save file. This means anything from objects to poses to nodes, pretty much anything, can be copied from one save file and pasted into another. This is extremely useful and will save you tons of time in the future. Below the two open options is Revert, which reverts the project you have open to its most recent save point. Saves in this way can work kind of like checkpoints. You can also recover your last session and load from autosaves. Blender has lots of ways to preserve your work other than a traditional save and load system. You can change how Blender autosaves your work in user preferences. Then there's Save, Save As, and Save Copy. Pretty straightforward, but it's useful to know that when you save a project more than once, Blender makes a duplicate of that save called a .blend1 file. To view your .blend1, 2, and 3 files, click Load, then navigate to this icon at the top of the window. It's a picture of a gray sheet of paper with a little orange Blender icon superimposed on it. Selecting this button will display .blend1, .blend2, and .blend3 files. Every time you save, Blender saves the previous save as a .blend1 file. This way, even if you save over a point you need to go back to, you can navigate here and load the correct .blend1, 2, or 3 file. You can change the way Blender saves .blend1, 2, and 3 files in User Preferences. Below Saving Options is User Preferences. You can change these, but I suggest only changing things you know you want to change. Below User Preferences is the option to save a new startup file, basically Blender's blank document, and the option to reload the factory settings. Then below that is Append. Append is how you add elements from other .blend files to your current project. Anything from objects to cameras to the whole scene can be added into your current project. Similarly, you can import objects that are not from .blend files, like, for instance, wavefront files, .obj, or FBX files, .fbx. You'll also notice that I have some extra options. That's because I have Blender add-ons installed to help me import a larger variety of file types. In addition to File, there's also an important tab up here to change the engine Blender runs on. When posing, you'll only ever be using Blender Render, but when I bake textures for my meshes, I do it in Cycles Render. For now, don't worry about this, but I'll be working on other engines in future videos. It's also important to note that I'm working on Blender 2.78. I've heard that Sims 4 Studio won't work with the latest versions of Blender, but I don't have any problems with that. You can choose to either download the earlier version linked from the Sims 4 Studio forums, or download the latest version from Blender's website. However, you won't be able to bake textures using cycle renders with previous versions of Blender. For this reason, I recommend downloading and using the latest version that I'm using, Blender 2.78. And one more thing, just to get comfortable with the program, adding and creating windows. Each window has the ability to display a different editor type. Most of the time, you'll be working with the 3D viewport in at least one of the windows. You can also add and take away windows by clicking and dragging this little area with 3 lines. You'll see those 3 lines in the corner of every window. By selecting and dragging, you can split the current window or merge windows. Remember that like windows must be merged with like windows, so split windows will have to be merged together before they can be merged with an unsplit window. You will create extra windows to add and bake materials and to edit UV maps for your meshes. Now that we've familiarized ourselves with Blender's interface a bit, we can move on to the actual program itself. Let's get started. The first thing you'll notice upon opening Blender is probably a cube. Then you might also notice the grid, maybe the camera in the upper left-hand corner, or the lamp in the upper right-hand corner. This window is in 3D view, which displays 3D objects. Blender's startup file starts you with a scene, basically your workspace in the 3D viewport. This scene is where you'll see the 3D model of the sim and where you interact with the bones and rigging to manipulate and pose the sim model. There are some 3D view specific toolbars and menus that I'll be going over in more depth later. For now, let's take a look at the other windows in our workspace. Directly below the 3D view, you'll see a toolbar. We'll also come back to this. Just know that the toolbar that appears below each window is always view specific, so if you were in, say, the UV editor, these options would be different. Below the toolbar is something that will probably look familiar, a timeline. Here you can navigate from frame to frame, scrub through your animation, and adjust playback settings. To the right of the timeline in 3D Viewport, you'll see the outliner, and below that, properties. The outliner does exactly what it sounds like it does. It gives you a quick overview of everything in your project. Every scene, object, lamp, camera, and curve will appear here, too. The outliner displays what objects you have selected by highlighting the text in white and the active mesh in orange. It will display useful information about any modifications made to the object to the right of the name. You can select objects in the outliner by left-clicking them and double-clicking to rename them. You can hide objects here, render them unselectable, and prevent them from being rendered, all from the outliner. It's a very useful organizational tool. Below that is the Properties tab. Here is where you will make modifications to the objects in the scene, add physics and materials, assign vertex groups, render and bake images, and many more things besides that. Most of the time, custom content creation will be using one of 4 tabs: Scene, indicated by a little camera icon, Modifiers, a wrench, Data, a triangle with 3 vertices, and Material, a light orange circle divided into 4 sections. Now, let's take a look at the toolbars specific to the 3D viewport. There are two toolbars here, displayed to the left and right of the window. Tools panel, which can be shown and hidden by pressing the hotkey T on your keyboard, and Screen Properties, which can be shown and hidden by pressing the hotkey N on your keyboard. The Tools panel has a variety of different tools used primarily for editing and creating 3D objects. I have a couple add-ons here that you won't see in your Tools panel unless you have them installed as well. The Screen Properties is used for changing the way you view and edit your scene. Here, there are a variety of tools I use in posing. Let's go over them in more depth now. Under the Transform tab, you can lock transformations along specific axes. I'll go more into depth with how I use this tab to help me pose better, faster, and more realistically in my next video. The next tab we'll be looking at is View, where you can change the way you view your scene. You can change your lens size, lock your view to a specific object in the scene, your cursor, or to a specific view. I recommend not messing with this too much. Below View is 3D Cursor. The 3D Cursor is this red and white dashed crosshair in the center of your scene. You move it by left-clicking. Below the 3D Cursor box is the Item box. This is very useful to have displayed during posing because it tells you what bone and rig you have selected. Below that is Display, where you can change how the 3D viewport displays the scene. Here you can change the settings to Only Rendered, enable a world background, enable or disable outline select, relationship lines, the grid floor, and different axes. The next tab we'll be discussing is Background Images, which allows you to import an image into the scene to be viewed from specific axes. This allows you to display reference pictures without having to tab back and forth between windows. Now, I'm going to go more into depth about the 3D viewport window and manipulating the objects you will import and create here. Let's start by just moving around the scene. To rotate your camera, simply middle mouse button click and drag. Go ahead and try that now. Middle mouse button click and drag. You can translocate your camera rather than rotate by holding shift down, middle mouse button clicking, and dragging. To zoom in and out, scroll in and out. Now, let's go over the number pad camera controls. You can switch in and out of perspective in orthographic mode by pressing 5 on your number pad. You can also change the viewport to 2 dimensions and change your scene from a specific axis. Pressing 1 or Control 1 will change the view to the front and the back, respectively, of the scene. Pressing 3 or Control 3 will change the view from right to left. And finally, pressing 7 or Control 7 will change the view from top to bottom. These camera controls will allow you to navigate your scene with ease. Go ahead and check out the cube and make sure you're comfortable with the camera movements before we go forward. Try to familiarize yourself with the number pad and moving around. You will need to sometimes look at things from odd angles, and the more comfortable you are moving around the scene, the easier posing will be. Besides the 3D viewport's camera, there is also a physical camera in the scene. The camera is primarily used as just that, a camera to take a picture, also known as a render, of the scene. You can switch to the physical camera's view by pressing 0 on your number pad. You can also change the active camera, should you have more than one, by selecting the camera you wish to be the active camera and pressing Ctrl 0 on your number pad. camera is an object, and thus can be transformed just like any other object. You can rotate it around a point, translocate it, and resize it. Besides rendering, I also use the camera quite extensively when posing multiple people in a scene. It's indispensable for finding out if your models are making eye contact. We'll go more in depth with the camera in the future, but take note of it, namely that it, unlike your regular camera, can be transformed in the scene, and that you can switch to its view by pressing 0 on your number pad. Now, like I said before, in the 3D viewport you should see a cube. This cube is a very simple 3D object. 3D objects, also referred to as meshes, are made up of 3 parts: vertices, edges, and planes. 2 or more vertices together form an edge, and 3 or more edges together create a plane, also known as a polygon. A cube has 6 faces, which means this cube's poly count is 6. More complicated, smoother 3D objects will have much higher poly counts. The kind of objects you see in photorealistic renders or Disney and Pixar animations will be in the hundreds of thousands. Sims 4 uses much simpler, blockier meshes. This makes the game run much more smoothly. This is why games that run on machines with limited capabilities have trouble opening when installed with high poly custom content. Now we're ready to interact with our scene. Let's start by selecting the cube by right-clicking on it. You will know it's selected because it will be outlined in orange. You can also deselect the cube by pressing A on your keyboard. A is the shortcut for select all and deselect all. In object mode, that means it will select all the objects in your scene. Don't forget that in the outliner you can hide objects and prevent them from being selected. For instance, if I were to navigate to the outliner, I could click the cursor icon next to the cube and it would prevent it from being selected. Even if I click on the cube, even if I press A, the cube will not be selected until I select the cursor icon. The outliner will also show you what you have selected because the orange triangle icon to the left of the name will be highlighted in orange when you have the object selected, and the name will be highlighted in white if it's the active object. Before selecting everything in your scene with A, you can also select the inverse of everything you currently have selected by pressing Ctrl-I. You can select everything you can see with a drag box by pressing B and dragging and clicking to select the objects you want. You can also similarly do this freehand by pressing and holding Ctrl and dragging to draw around the objects you want to select. You can also select individual objects concurrently by pressing and holding Shift and right-clicking the objects you want to select. So, make sure the cursor icon in your outliner is selected and right-click on your cube in the 3D viewport to select it. Now we can manipulate the cube in object mode, which is the mode we're in. You can tell because of the way the object is shaded, and because underneath the 3D viewport, this object interaction mode box is set to object mode. In object mode, you can scale, rotate, and translocate objects, but you cannot directly edit the mesh itself. There are several ways to translocate the cube. The first and most obvious way is by selecting it and right-clicking it and dragging it around. Once you've began to move the cube, you can let go of the mouse button and move your mouse and the cube around the scene freely. You can then decide to commit to the move by left-clicking or pressing Enter, or you can choose to let the cube snap back into its original position by right-clicking or pressing Escape. You can also move the cube by pressing the G hotkey on your keyboard. This is useful because then you can type in a value, say 2, and move the cube 2 units forward along the x-axis. In addition to moving along an axis, you can translocate along every axis except a specific axis. Let's say I wanted to move this cube along the floor, but I didn't want to move it up into the air. I'd want to translocate the cube along the x and y axes, but not along the z-axis. So I would type G, then Shift, then the axis I want to exclude. In this instance, Z. So G, Shift, Z, and then I can move the cube in any direction I want, except the axis I excluded. In this instance, the Z-axis. You can also move objects freehand, but snap to individual axes as guides by either right-clicking and dragging or pressing G, then middle mouse button clicking and dragging. Let's say that I moved the cube and decided that I didn't like where I moved it to. I could reset the object back to the origin by pressing Alt-G. The object will always reset with its 3D Manipulator Widget to the origin. The 3D Manipulator Widget is this little orange dot in the center of the cube. Not every object will have the 3D Manipulator Widget in the center of the object, but all objects will have one, and every new object you add to the scene will have it in the center. Besides translocating the objects in object mode, you can also rotate them and resize them. The same principles we learned while translocating the cube can be applied here, except you can't right-click and drag to rotate or resize. The hotkey to rotate is R. You can then rotate the object around the 3D Manipulator widget. You can do this freehand, or you can also type R, the axis you want to rotate around, and the degrees you want to rotate it. For instance, let's say I wanted to rotate this cube 45 degrees around the y-axis. I would type R, Y, 45. To rotate along an axis freehand, I'd simply type R, the axis I want to rotate around, and then do my rotation. You can see when you select the axis, it highlights. You can change axes before committing to any changes, and the object will snap back to its original rotation, and the new axis you selected will highlight. To undo any rotations, you can press Alt-R, and the object will snap back to its original rotation. And with resizing, the same principles apply. The hotkey is S, and you can resize along any axis or simply resize it around the 3D Manipulator widget. You can do this freehand or by typing in the desired value. Remember that you are multiplying the value of the object, so if you want it to be a third the size, you would type 0.3334, and if you wanted it to be a third bigger, you type 1.3334. You can also, again, do this along specific axes. So, if I wanted to turn my cube into a rectangle with perfect dimensions, I would type S, the axis I wanted to resize along. Let's resize along Z, and then 2, because I want it to be twice the length along the Z axis. If I wanted to resize it to its original size, I could press S, Z, 0.5, or I could press Alt-S. With these controls, you should now be able to move around the scene and transform objects. Let's review what we've learned. You now know how to navigate around the scene and the number pad hotkeys to view your scene along a specific axis. 1, Control 1, 3, Control 3, 7, and Control 7. You know 0 changes your view to the camera, and 5 switches you in and out of orthographic and perspective mode. You also know the shortcuts to transform objects, G to translocate, R to rotate, and S to resize. You know how to undo those transformations by pressing Alt and the shortcut associated with the transformation, either G, R, or S. You know that middle mouse button clicking and dragging will allow you to transform the object around specific axes as guides. You know that when translocating or resizing, you can exclude a specific axis by pressing the hotkey and then Shift and the axis you want to exclude. And finally, you know that you can use B or Control and drag to select multiple objects, or you can hold down Shift and right-click on objects you want to select concurrently. Feel free to play around with the cube and re-watch this part of the video until you feel comfortable moving around the 3D viewport and transforming objects. Now we're going to go more in depth and learn about edit mode. First, let's navigate down to the toolbar directly below the 3D viewport and above the timeline. The first box you'll see is the editor type selector. We're in 3D view right now in this window. You can change the editor type of the window here. Then you'll see several drop-down menus and the object interaction mode box, the shader selection, transformation orientations, layers, and several other things that I won't be going over in this tutorial series. The drop-down menus primarily do actions that can be done with hotkeys. So, if you ever forget what a hotkey I use is, navigate down to this area and you can almost assuredly find it. For instance, the number pad hotkeys I referenced earlier can be found here under the View menu, and the transformation hotkeys I referenced earlier can be found under the Object menu. Besides View, there's also Select, used for selecting objects in your scene, Add, used to add new 3D objects, cameras, curves, and light sources to the scene, and Object, which is primarily object manipulations such as rotating, translocating, and resizing, among others. Add is pretty straightforward. You add an object to your scene. You can add extra cameras, lights, meshes, or curves. You can also do this by pressing Shift-A in your 3D viewport and selecting what you want to add from the menu that appears. Next to that series of menu, you'll see these little boxes. The first box you'll see is the Object Interaction Mode box. This is where and how you will move in and out of different modes in your scene. Right now, we're in object mode, which means that we can interact with the objects in our scene, but we cannot edit the underlying structure of them. The mesh itself will remain intact no matter what we do to it in the 3D viewport, short of deleting it. You'll notice when you click on this box, there's no pose mode available. That's because you don't have a rigged model in the scene, so there's no pose to go into. When we import a rigged sim model into the scene, you'll be able to go into pose mode. For now, let's switch from object mode to edit mode. You can do this by either navigating to the box and selecting edit mode from the drop-down menu, or by pressing Tab on your keyboard. Switch in and out of edit and object mode now, and take note of a few differences. For one, if you have the Tools panel and Screen Properties tabs to your left and right open, you'll notice the options there change. You'll also notice that the cube itself changes in appearance. You can now see the vertices, edges, and planes of the object. In the outliner, the triangle icon to the right of the name will be highlighted in white. Now, you can select more than the entire object. You can select individual vertices, edges, and planes. You probably have Vertex Select on, but if you don't worry. You can change to Vertex Select by selecting the little orange vertex icon over here. You can also change to Edge Select and Plane Select. Notice how the appearance of the 3D object changes when you change selections. In addition to that, you can shift-click to choose multiple selection modes. Let's shift-click all of the modes to better illustrate how you can transform the vertices, edges, and planes in Edit mode. Now you can click on a single vertex of the cube in the 3D viewport and take note of a few things. One thing you'll notice is that the 3 edges connected to the vertex turn orange, and the vertex you clicked on turns white. White means this is your active object. Orange indicates that it's selected. The reason the edges are orange, even though you didn't directly select them, is because those edges are part of that vertex. This simple cube mesh will not have any, but oftentimes meshes can have double vertices, or could have been formed from 2 separate objects. This means that selecting a vertex will not necessarily select all of the edges you'd expect intuitively for it to select. Again though, simple meshes generally won't work like that. All 8 of this cube's vertices are connected, and so manipulating one vertex will manipulate all the edges it's attached to. It also means were you to delete that vertex, it would delete the edge with it. After all, rays, or edges in this case, are lines made up of 2 points, so if you select one, you delete the edge as well. Thus, selecting 2 connected vertices will select the edge, and selecting enough connected edges and vertices will select the plane they form. You can use the principles we learned in object mode to manipulate the cube here. You can transform either the vertices, edges, or planes. You'll quickly realize that the possibilities of how you can transform objects in Blender is truly limitless. That's one of the most exciting things about Blender. There's always something new to learn, something to figure out, and an exciting way to realize your imagination. Creation isn't just for professional 3D artists with powerful computers and expensive 3D modeling software. You can make anything you want in Blender. You are truly limited by nothing. As you can see, there's pretty much no limits to how you can transform the vertices, edges, and planes of the mesh. One important thing to note is that there is no Alt-G, R, and S to undo changes you make. The only way you can undo changes in edit mode is with Ctrl-Z. Depending on how much memory you have available on your computer, you can change how many steps Blender will remember for you to Ctrl-Z back to. This is why, when editing meshes especially, it's important to save frequently. I save any time I make a significant change to a mesh. Most of my meshes have 5 to 10 saves of it, and that's only for editing the mesh. You never know when you'll make a mistake that will require you to revert the file and start over, and you want that file to be as close to what you were working on as possible. That about wraps it up for the first video in my custom content tutorial series. Feel free to comment with any questions or concerns, and I look forward to seeing you all in my next video, where I'll be going over the basics of posing and sharing some tips and tricks I've learned to make beautiful, realistic poses quickly. Thanks for watching!